Good afternoon. I know there is quite a wide audience out there with more than 1,200 participants. I'm very glad to be back after the summer with these IFA International seminars. Today, we are happy to give the floor to Stephen Voloshin, Professor of Medicine at Dartmouth Institute for Health Policy and Clinical Practice in New Hampshire, who is also the founder and director of the Lisa Schwartz Foundation for Truth in Medicine. Discussant will be Professor Holger Schoenemann, Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at McMaster and Director of the Canadian Cochrane Centre and founder member of the GRADE Centre at McMaster. We have chosen quite an emerging title, meaning Drug Information, How to Improve Communication of Study Results. A not topic during COVID, I would say, but an issue that for, in my view, more than 20 years has been discussed by the research community on how to improve, in general, study results presentation and how to be maybe short and clear. Next. So the fundamental idea is that probably to be short and clear is better than be large, comprehensive, and thick in density, though the dossier coming from drug evaluation for drug approval is a long process, and maybe also now systematic review and guideline production is a similar long process producing large document. Next, please. So I'd like just briefly to say why IFA, being part of the national health system, providing also independent information, is particularly interested beyond drug approval in the topic, and just a few comments shared with also the guideline community recently on where we are on guideline production and format. Next. So please, it's an animated one, if you can just show it. So also next. So in Europe, medicines are registered by the European agency with an evaluation of the benefit-risk ratio on a one-by-one basis. When they are approved in Italy, IFA has to define the place in therapy, give a judgment and an evaluation on innovation status, define recommendation for optimal uses or reimbursement for selected population, and also it defines the price. Next, please. But IFA also manages an independent research fund, not large, but specifically dedicated to comparative effectiveness evaluation of available options. Often we approve drugs and medicines on a similar basis of potential efficacy or effectiveness. Well, we don't always have comparative data available. Next. We should also run programs on independent information for our NHS and prescribers. I have to say this should be a joint investment of the Italian NHS, or as it is a highly devoluted system of the regional health systems. Two other click with the two next, so that I conclude on IFA. Also next one, please. IFA also has an important role in monitoring the use of medicines with regular reports on medicines use, also in various categories, including pregnancy, the elderly, antibiotic use, and so forth. And very recently, a couple of months ago, 2 national ethics committee have been given to IFA in terms of scientific secretariat, the pediatric one and the one on advanced therapies, to have only one ethical approval for the whole country. Next. But as I said before, it's for the NHS and also for somehow providing support to reduce local or national variability in medicines use that IFA is quite interested in providing the best available information to doctors and prescribers. Next. So where are we in general on guidelines, production, and systematic review development to support guidelines and recommendations? Next, please. Probably one of the best in terms of methodology and format for producing the guideline has been a bit more than 10 years ago, the one on antithrombotic therapy, that has developed not only very good methodology, but also the question and answer format, the PICO, and the adoption of GRADE. However, this guidelines next is pretty large, with 600 recommendation and a thick, in my view, high value volume of almost 1,000 pages. And when published, the group, Holger and Gordon Guyot and others, underscored, please, a couple of clicks, that it could also well be that these were high and difficult volumes to manage, and in terms of practical use. Next, also in Europe, I think it's very important that the guidelines are more and more produced at European level, moving from the local and the national to the European one, which I think we all believe this is a tendency to support up to Europe or up to WHO in terms of international collaborations. And this is an example of the atrial fibrillation one published in the European Heart Journal, is more than 100 pages, please, a couple of clicks, with a pretty large index, 2 clicks more, please, with a table of contents of several pages showing, next one, please, showing all the detailed chapters for which recommendations were developed. So there is an issue of large formats and how rapidly doctors can access these high value and relevant information. Next, please. 20 years ago, at the British Medical Journal, in several editorial boards, were discussed the issues of, can we improve study results presentation after a structured abstract were developed 25 or 30 years ago. And in a session with some of the founders of both ABM and Cochrane, David Sackett and Doug Altman, some reasoning was brought forward, meaning researchers tend to prefer or actually use relative measures to express differences and statistical significance of the various tests applied. Next, but clinical decisions and also policy makers and politicians reason and need absolute measure, meaning what proportion of patient will benefit or how big is the results in terms of absolute numbers. Next. They provided, in my view, a very smart format that actually was never implemented, meaning there are some issues there in preparing so well every paper that is published. This is an example for randomized trial, with the idea that the context of the baseline risk in the control arm is one of the most important information, together with the population selected and treated. and the results of a non-real trial testing a new antibiotic called Randomized, showing a reduction in mortality of 2% absolute, reducing mortality from 10 to 8%, is a relative risk reduction of 20%, with an NNT of 50, or 2 every 100 patients saved by the treatment. So this is to stress how this way of thinking has been promoted by the founder of ABM and the Cochrane as the most relevant information that often can get missed in the final publication, or can easily be missed. Next. Next, please. Not just the title. So to summarize, we need actually 3 sets of information, so not much, to be clearly represented. The context and the baseline risk, the actual results in terms of absolute, privileging the absolute reduction in terms of differences, and the implication in terms of NNT or population level gains, of course, together with the risks that should always be part of the reasoning. Next. Very recently, just to give initially the big picture of this, I would say, important topic, many or most of the, or some of the most important journals, this is the New England, have recently devised and designed ways of presenting in a page the result of a study. Next. Or next, please. Or in graphic abstract, summarize the actual results with all the numbers I've been showing before, also in terms of design. Next, please. To explain why we involved Cochrane and Grade. Friends, this is a format that is produced by Grade and Cochrane table, showing the actual baseline risk, the relative effect, and privileging the absolute numbers over the hazard ratio that is stable across different baseline risks, but the actual gains and benefit differ depending on the actual baseline risk. I would probably conclude here so that I've let you understood why we invited Steve Voloshin to present, and why we then asked Holger Schulme to give some comments on the topic. So I leave the floor to Steve Voloshin. I thank him for coming to Rome this morning, for giving a very nice and lively seminar, and now for coming here for another presentation. Please, Steve, the floor is yours.
Great. Can you see my slides? Yes? Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm going to talk, my talk is called Think Inside the Box, How to Improve the Communication of Drug Information. And just want to say that all the work was done with Lisa Schwartz, who tragically died a few years ago. I don't have any disclosures other than to say that I'm really happy to be here today. I don't have any industry funding, and I do have grants from 2 nonprofit foundations which support my research. I'm going to talk about 2 things. First, about better drug information, and I'm going to introduce something called the drug facts box. And then the second half is going to be talk about how to help people become wiser consumers of information. So let's start with the drug box. So we really need better drug information. Communication about prescription drugs is problematic. I'm sure that you all know that. There's many examples in the United States of FDA drug labeling, missing important benefit, harm, and uncertainty data. It's the same for medical journal articles. It's the same for media stories. And a recent systematic review of articles assessing the quality of news stories about the effects of health interventions, found some serious problems. 40% of these news stories only 40% noted potential harms, and only 17% reported absolute risks. And we just heard about the importance of absolute risk presentations. So there's a lot of work to be done to make things better. So let's take a step back. What do people need to make good decisions? So to make good decisions, you need a sense of the facts. You need to know what the menu of options are and what the likely outcomes are if you decide to do one thing versus another. But you also have to have some clarity about your values. So how much you care about the different outcomes, how much you care about what you have to do in order to either increase or decrease the chance of those outcomes or the balance of benefit and harm. And it's only by putting facts and values together that you can get to a good decision. So this is a very nice model of decision making, but the problem is it falls apart very easily, and that's because facts are sometimes very hard to get. And what happens is if you don't have the facts, you can't get to good decisions. And in the United States, at least, most drug facts that the public sees are in the form of direct-to-consumer advertising, which is an enormous industry. This graph just shows time trend in spending on direct-to-consumer advertising in the United States. In the early 1990s, the FDA relaxed some of the restrictions, and there was this explosion, this exponential growth in direct-to-consumer drug advertising. It's now actually, that's 2015 was $5 billion. It's now closer to $7 billion. Just to give you some context, the total FDA budget is about a little under $5 billion. So it's just an incredible amount of investment by industry compared to the amount of money that's invested in the regulator. Now, you don't have direct-to-consumer advertising in the EU. Part of it is thanks to people like Nicola Magrini, who helped vote against it. And I think there was a wise idea, because what we really need, and he said this in this BMJ editorial, that we need reliable, comparative, patient-centered information. And unfortunately, the drug ads really don't do that. I'm just going to show you a few just in case you're not familiar with them. It's an American phenomenon, but it's pretty amazing. This is sort of like a typical drug ad. Here it is, a celebrity, this woman named Joan London, who used to be famous. And she's advertising this drug called Claritin, which is an antihistamine, and she just asserts that it works. Works for me. I tried a million different kinds of antihistamines that made me drowsy. Then my doctor gave me this one. So this is an assertion of benefit. There's no data, and FDA doesn't require advertisements to have any benefit data. This is another one which is a little more sophisticated. This is for a drug called Resulin, a drug for diabetes. And this one's a little fancier. There's a claim. The woman claims, now I have my blood sugar under control. And it is pretty fancy. It has like these pictures of cells, and on the one on the left, there's all these red dots all over the place. And then if you take this drug called Resulin, look what happens on the right, all the dots line up. So clearly this drug is really, working and doing important stuff. And there's data here. More than 1 million people have begun using Resulin to help manage their diabetes. Of course, that's data about popularity. It's not data about benefit. And ironically, this drug eventually was pulled from the market because of fatal liver problems. So the ad really should say more than 1 million people have stopped using Resulin to manage their diabetes. And then here's just one more. This is one that actually has data. So this is an ad for Lipitor, and the claim here is that it reduces the chance of stroke by nearly half. And it has this clever graphic which shows a Lipitor pill shooting through the word stroke, dividing it nearly in half. Very clever. The question is, half of what? I mean, it sounds great, but if you don't know that half of what part, you don't really know what this means. So this is really a very deceptive ad. This is an example of a relative change without giving the underlying base rate. If you looked at the data that the ad is based on, there is a trial, and in it, Lipitor reduced the chance of stroke over 4 years from 2.8% to 1.5%. Now, you might think that's big, or you might think it's small, but that's up to you. And the point is, you can't make a judgment like that if you don't actually have the numbers in front of you. Which seems more impressive, a 50% reduction or a 1.3 percentage point reduction? which is the absolute version. Clearly, one is more impressive than the other. It's a phenomenon called framing. And the information is the same, but the psychological impact is different. And it's important, if we're going to help patients and clinicians make good decisions, that they have the absolute numbers. So this is really an example of exaggerated data. And then the last one I want to show you is Plavix, which is a drug used for a number of indications. This one is about to prevent a heart attack or a stroke, a second heart attack or stroke. And what I want to just point out here is the front page is this picture of this guy at the Grand Canyon, very beautiful picture. The back page, this is typical. It's this thing called the brief summary, which is this fine print massive information, which it's a misnomer. It's not brief. It's not a summary. What it has is data about side effects. It's required by the FDA. There's nothing about benefit. So you can't really weigh benefit and harm. It's also impossible to read. So this is an example of non-communication or pro forma communication. Now these were selected examples, but I just want to say that we did a systematic look at a while ago at American direct consumer ads, and it's really the rule, not the exception. Benefit is generally asserted with vague qualitative statements. If data are presented, only 13% of the time was data presented, it's done typically like in the Lipitor ad with an exaggerated format, relative risk without a base rate. So Lisa and I thought, we got to do better, and there's got to be a way to communicate information transparently to patients and doctors and prescribers. And the question was, how do we, what would be a consistent structured format? How would we do it? And we were talking about this over breakfast one day, and we were eating our Cocoa Krispies, and we noticed on the side of the box, the nutrition facts box, which we have in the United States, and many countries, including Italy, have this. It's an idea where the regulator in the United States is the same FDA, is requiring manufacturers to give information about nutrition products, not the so here it's you can quibble whether this is useful information about the calories and the distribution of calories according to the ingredients, but the idea is a regulator is requiring information to be given to consumers to help guide their decision making. And we thought, if you could do this for Cocoa Krispies, why can't you do it for drugs? Why can't you do it for Lipitor? Not the ingredients, right, but benefit and harm information. And we came up with a thing called a drug facts box, which does just that. It's modeled on the nutrition box. And I just wanted to point out the heart of the box is this table. It's a simple tabular display with benefit and side effect information side by side. And so it tells you what the drug is approved, what the claim that the drug, the advertising or the indication for the drug, how well the drug works versus a comparator. In this case, it's against a placebo. And then with it, right next to it is side effect information. Again, with the side effect information in the comparator group and in the drug group. And this way you can see all the information in the same place, and you can make a judgment whether you think the benefits outweigh the harms. So the information for drug boxes ideally comes from the regulator. We try to let people know what FDA knew at the time of approval. So when drugs are approved, the companies submit these vast quantities of information about all the trials that they've done, published and unpublished data, and then FDA reviewers in a variety of different domains look at it and they write reports. Takes maybe 6 months. They're like very detailed reports, and sometimes the FDA will convene external review boards, advisory boards, if it's a first-in-class drug, or if if it's in a class where there are particular problems that they're concerned about. And all this information, all the reports and all that are generated are available publicly online. I mean, some bits and pieces are redacted because sometimes things are considered proprietary, but largely all this information is there. So it's an incredible gold mine of information. You can know what the regulator knew at the time of drug approval. You just go online, you pop in the name of the drug, and then you get to a page where you can choose to read the reviews. Like I often focus on the medical reviews and the statistical reviews, but there are other reviews as well in other information domains. And the problem is these reviews are really long. Like this one was 403 pages long, and they're really poorly organized and weakly summarized. So it's a real slog to get through them, but it's really worth it if you want to understand what these experts knew these experts who had access to the best drug information. And that's what we want to do. We want to extract that and summarize it in a simple table as best we can. So it's a gold mine. Now it's interesting, there's all this information that's generated during the approval process. And the FDA is writing these incredible reports. But what the public sees is only a very small subset of that information. There's the approved labeling, which is the sort of tissue package insert when you buy a prescription product and you take it out, and it tells you prescribers how and why to use the drug, and it's the source of all advertising claims. But it's written by the drug companies. So there's a lot of opportunity for spin and selective reporting, and we've got lots of examples of problematic labeling. But the public generally doesn't even see that. Most, the FDA has done studies themselves that show that almost nobody reads these things. People do see the ads, like I mentioned, and sometimes people will look at the ad in the brief summary. And again, that's a very small subset of information, and it gets skewed toward detailed information about harms, and then just very cursory information, assertions really about benefit, very unbalanced. So there's this incredible loss of information from what FDA knew to what's out in the public. So we thought this is important to get this information out there. So we developed this idea, and in 2002, a million years ago, we called FDA and told them about our idea. They invited us there. We met with 20 officials. They liked the idea, but they said it would take an act of Congress to get drug boxes on ads, and they challenged us to show that consumers want value and understand benefit data. So we did a bunch of studies. We did surveys with consumers. Almost all preferred the drug box over a traditional drug ad. They thought it gave more information, more reliable information, more important information. We showed that most people could navigate the box and understand the information. We did comprehension tests. On average, people were scoring 4 out of 5 comprehension questions. Even people with limited formal education, so less than a high school diploma, still got more than 3 out of 5 answers correct. So it seemed like we were able to communicate the information well, and we were always tinkering with formatting and stuff to make it as good as possible. Ultimately, the Institute of Medicine, which is a big advisory group that advises the U.S. government, they challenged us to create a drug box so that they could see just how useful this thing would be and how long it would take to generate one and all that. So they challenged us to do a box for a drug called Zometa. Now, neither Lisa nor I had ever heard of it, and so what did we do? We went to the FDA website because we knew that's the best source of information, and we read all the reviews and carefully studied it, and we created a box. And I'll just quickly show you. The top part of the box is just descriptive information. What's the drug for? Who might consider using it? What should I be aware of? What other choices there are? And we think this is really important information to give consumers and prescribers context. But the heart of the box is the study table. And so here it starts out with a description of the study. In this case, it was a study with 275 people with cancer and high calcium levels. They had high calcium from metastatic cancer, and they were given Zometa or the current standard of care, Iridia. And here's what happened. And by the way, this was the main study that FDA approval was based on. So it was a 3-arm trial. There were 2 doses of Zometa and 1 dose of the standard of care. And what we do in the box is we define the outcomes, and we have a hierarchy. There are surrogate outcomes. So these are like laboratory measures. These aren't things that people directly experience. And then we have patient outcomes. These are things that people directly experience, how they feel, how long they live. And then we also try to define death as well. And in this case, the surrogate outcome was defined in the trials as people having their calcium lowered at 2 weeks to less than 10.8. That's a threshold that the company chose. And it turned out that in the Iridia group, 70% of people made the threshold, but in the Zometa 4 milligram group, 88% did it. So that seemed like the drug works better than the comparator. And the 8 milligram group had about the same effect. So it looks like 8 milligrams worked about the same, and both are better than the comparator. In terms of patient outcomes, there were none studied, and this happens, unfortunately, a lot. And as a principle of the drug box, we think it's important to tell people what we know, but also to tell them what we don't know. So we know it will lower your calcium, but we don't know if people feel any better. And then they did study death in the trial. Death from all causes at 8 weeks. And remember, these are very sick people with metastatic cancer. So a lot died. In the Iridia group, 19% died by 8 weeks. but in the Zometa 4 milligram group, about the same number, 19% died. But 33% died in the 8 milligram group. That's pretty striking difference, and it's statistically significant difference. This is not just random chance, and it's very concerning. And when we looked in the FDA review documents, we found this report from the statistical reviewer, which says both 4 and 8 milligram doses satisfied the criteria for primary efficacy, so they lowered calcium, but the 8 milligram dose had a somewhat higher death rate. Now, that's not exactly a big alarm bell. I mean, to me, almost doubling the death rate is a big deal. But in any event, they at least pointed that out. So when we saw that, what we decided was in our box, we wouldn't say anything about the 8 milligram. We wouldn't give the data. We would just give a warning: don't use it. The trials have shown that it's no more effective, but it has a higher mortality rate. In fact, in the original FDA-approved labeling, it said that there was no additional benefit for the high over the low dose. However, the risk of renal toxicity was significantly greater, which nothing about death, which is crazy. So after our presentation, FDA actually changed that. The other thing is very disturbing is we just were curious what was reported in the medical literature. So we looked at the study that corresponds to the trial that was published in the medical literature. It was this paper. And in this paper, the conclusion was zoledronic acid is superior. The 4 milligram dose is recommended for initial treatment and 8 for relapsed. Which is crazy because we know that it's doubling the death rate. So it's insane. Death data weren't reported in the article at all. So this is a great example of selective reporting, which of course is a problem, especially in industry-funded studies. Sometimes trials with favorable results are more likely to be published, or only favorable outcomes within the trial reported, or there's spin, where results and conclusions that overstate benefit or minimize harm, including portraying negative studies as positive because of an effect in some subgroup and so on. So with the drug box, we're trying to capture all that stuff and not allow spin to come through like that. So in any event, when we did all these trials, ultimately FDA wanted to see a big trial to show that it actually affected people's decision making. So we did a national randomized trial. We had 231 people randomly selected from across the country, and we gave them a real-world challenge. We showed people ads for 2 drugs treating the same condition. One of them was called Maxtor. It was a proton pump inhibitor, and one of them was called Amsid. It's an H2 blocker. And we showed people the actual ads. The only thing we did was we changed some of the words around by using Pig Latin. So like Merck might become Erkme, but otherwise it's exactly what people would see in a real ad. And the drugs were chosen because they had similar side effects, but one was substantially more effective than the other. So there was an objectively correct answer. You should choose one over the other, assuming that pricing was the same. And the question was, can people choose the objectively better drug? So in the trial, we randomized people to get the ad the way it looks in reality, or the ad plus one of our drug boxes. And it's a tough task because you have to look at benefit and harm information for 2 different drugs and weigh them and balance them and decide which is better. And what we found was that people did a great job. So the main outcome of the study was, if you could take either drug for free, which would you rather take? And in the control group, 31% chose the objectively better drug, but in the drug box group, 68% chose it. So that was a big effect. And we were so really excited about it. We presented it to FDA, and we published the paper. And so it was a nice idea. What happened? Well, what happened was the FDA's Risk Communication Advisory Committee unanimously voted that FDA should adopt the drug facts box as a standard format for presenting information for clinicians and for the public. And it was actually written into the Affordable Care Act, or the Obamacare Act, which was the big piece of legislation in the United States redefining a lot of the health benefits. And we were really excited. We thought, wow, we've changed the world and everything. Here's a picture of Obama signing the thing, and we're section 3507 of the act, and we were ready to retire. But unfortunately, FDA doesn't have to listen to its advisory committees, and in this case it didn't, and they're not doing it for a variety of reasons. So instead, Lisa and I tried to kind of push them. We published an op-ed in the New York Times about the drug box. Some forward-thinking organizations like Consumer Reports, which is a big consumer magazine in the United States, ran drug boxes that we wrote for them about a bunch of different drugs. And you know, we had some funding to try to create drug boxes, but unfortunately that funding's run out. But if you're interested in reading more about it, there's a paper here in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which tells the history of the drug facts box and many of the issues that obtain. Next steps are what I'm currently working on is trying to secure some more funding to restart the drug box engine. It's kind of work intensive to gather up all the information, and I'd like to also start gathering up information from other regulators besides just the FDA. And I'm looking for partners and people who are interested in developing this idea. So that's really all I have to say about the drug box right now. So maybe I'll pause here, and Holger, I don't know if you wanted to step in with any questions or at this point.
Yeah, Stephen, so thanks very much for that. Nicola had asked me to reflect on that, and my idea was that I would now take this wonderful information and put it in the context of work that has actually built on the work that you've done with Lisa, and that relates to the development of summary of findings tables, where we compile research evidence and bring it together. And Nicola, that's still the intention. Then I would spend about 5 minutes on that, and then I think Nicola was going to moderate questions and answers at a later stage. Is that
correct? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I can share my screen. I know that the organizers should be able to do that.
Yep, we can see.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Can you see it? Thank you. Great. Okay. So again, in follow-up to Dr. Woloshin's presentation and the incredibly important work that really has changed the way that medications are viewed and the information is understood. I wanted to speak about how this background work has been utilized in the context of in particular of systematic reviews, and some follow-up work that I believe is equally important with regards to consumers of health information actually understanding information. So I also don't have any financial disclosures here to make. I have a few roles of organizations that I might be mentioning today. So two very quick points about summary of findings tables and standardized wording to express confidence in research and effects. Dr. Magrini introduced the summary of findings tables, and I will expand on that a little bit. This actually goes back to, again, the work that Lisa Schwartz and Stephen Woloshin led in that, for instance, one of the important pieces of the summary of findings table is that desirable health effects are equally important as the desirable health effects that an intervention might have. So here's an example using probiotics in the context of antibiotics for the prevention of pediatric antibiotic-associated diarrhea in children in particular. So, and you see here that a typical summary of findings table will always talk about any critical outcome where adverse effects are obviously one of them. This has led to work that focuses on presenting this information in a more interactive format. These are the versions of the summary of findings tables that are called the ISOFs, or interactive summary of findings tables, that are a integral part of any decision-making tool that uses systematic reviews now and are pretty much standard for Cochrane systematic reviews, for JBI systematic reviews, as well as others. And I want to give you this example here. We've worked a lot, and Dr. Magrini referred to our antithrombotic guidelines. We've worked a lot in the field of DVT, or deep venous thrombosis and venous thromboembolism, in particular around prevention. And here is an example of using a blood thinner to prevent pulmonary embolism in patients who are being prophylaxed in the hospital. And you see here that we are using absolute effects of the information of the intervention, and we've now, based on I would clearly say on this background work that we've heard about, we provide narratives in these interactive summary of findings tables so that people can not only look at the number, those who are more challenged actually have a narrative here with natural frequencies based on systematic reviews that suggest that natural frequencies are perhaps better understood. There is graphical representation of this information to support, again, understanding and dissemination of the information here with narratives again, and graphical presentation of what actually happens in terms of risk differences. And this is also graphically supported with, for instance, confidence intervals around it, as well as click-through information that allows people to understand what, for instance, a confidence interval is. So I wanted to also just briefly review why these summary of findings tables are actually so integral, similar to what you did with the work that convinced the FDA. We did randomized controlled trials to see whether or not the summary of findings tables actually do improve in understanding. This is a trial that was led by Sarah Rosenbaum. After the pilot work was the first trial in a smaller setting, though. And this randomized trial initially showed that it was much easier to find the results when the systematic review included a summary of findings table, that more correct answers to questions regarding the results, and these differences were dramatic if you look here at these risk differences. And more importantly, perhaps for busy clinicians and other busy people, that it took much less time to understand the results of a systematic review that had a summary of findings table included. We then did a few other studies that focused on further enhancing the understanding of information and summary of findings tables. I just wanted to show you this, that there are actually trials that have supported the use of these summary of findings tables. Further follow-up work that came from these summary of findings tables was actually related then to applying the grade context, so grading the grades of certainty in an expression of actual study results. So this is an expanded summary of findings that we also call evidence profile, where the results of randomized trials on the outcome mortality are displayed, including a certainty rating here, moderate certainty. And I'm just showing this as a quick example where you see a relative risk of 0.72 and an absolute effect of 97 fewer per 1,000 in people with tuberculosis, in particular tuberculosis meningitis, and there's 97 fewer deaths in these people shown here. So how should this be interpreted? The magnitude of the effect, which most people would say maybe pretty large, 10% reduction, 97 fewer per 1,000, and it comes with moderate certainty. We have found over time that authors of systematic reviews in particular, and others who communicate information, had very different interpretations for what moderate certainty would mean and how to express the magnitude of the effect. So we spent time on standardizing this. This is from Great Guidance that was published 2 years ago, where based on, I would say, pretty extensive research, we provided standardized ways of formulating effect sizes and expressing the certainty of the evidence from an evidence synthesis, so going beyond the single study. So for instance, a moderate effect with moderate certainty, users or authors of systematic reviews would have various options to choose from in order to express this that we had tested with users. So for instance, this would read here, initial adjuvant corticosteroid therapy probably reduces mortality with the effect size showing here. It's a moderate effect based on moderate certainty in order to standardize these particular expressions of the results. And that is available for high certainty evidence to very low certainty evidence, where we clearly state that there is a lot of uncertainty. To go back to the issues that I think Stephen raised with regards to, for instance, the direct-to-consumer advertisement. So this makes this a little bit larger for everybody. And then very quickly to follow up, this is not everything. I think there is a number of other issues that we need to address, in particular in the context of evidence synthesis. So we have these plain language statements now that express the effect sizes and the certainty of the evidence. But there is still a lot of room for error. So we have started to automate these interpretations so that people can actually choose an effect size and the narrative statements by basically using software that makes these suggestions so that this wording is actually appropriately standardized. And then finally, another area that I think will hopefully lead to some discussion. Another area is, how do consumers of health information actually understand the information that we provide around particular outcomes? So I've worked for a long time in the field of pulmonary medicine, and lung function was always something that was measured in trials, and that was not understood, and it meant fairly little to people. Venous thromboembolism sounds also very complicated. So work that we've done currently and is supplementing the summary of findings tables focuses on health outcome descriptors or marker states, where we in standardized ways express for consumers what these outcomes actually mean. So if there's a reduction in venous thromboembolism or deep venous thrombosis, we provide information in 4 domains that tested in guidelines in particular, so that we can actually tie these health outcome descriptors to the summary of findings tables when a particular outcome is described. So some research that we did quite extensively actually in the major guideline development effort that describes how this was done. And these health outcome descriptors have other functions as well. They help with prioritization of outcomes and the communication of an outcome was chosen, calibration of people who decisions about a particular outcome, the judgment of indirectness of the outcomes, so surrogacy, for instance, and the communication that I mentioned amongst guideline group members, but also communication with the public or patients, for instance, in decision aids. And I stop here with this first part, an extension of the actual work that I think was so well presented there, focusing on evidence synthesis and really also bringing this issue around outcomes and standardized wording to consumers.
So thank you, Holger. I think your presentation was really integrating what Steve has introduced. Let me just socialize one thing which I found when I arrived in IFA 2 years and a half ago, which is that in the evaluation, so it's not my merit, but I think is excellent that IFA has adopted great quality of evidence criteria to define innovation for new medicines, which means that we can give judgment based on relative certainties, as you have shown, and I'm glad to share. This probably is not known to many. There is a question for probably both of you. Very interesting to get information from the patient side. Are PROM, patient-related outcomes, enough? I refer it to you. Anyone who wants to.
Enough? I'm sorry, are they enough?
Are patient-related outcomes enough? Which I don't know.
Patient-reported outcomes enough.
Yeah.
So I'll take, well, Stephen, if you want to get started on that,
You can
I
start.
have a quick answer on that.
Sure, let's hear your quick answer.
Okay, I think the patient-reported outcomes are not enough because they don't help us with communication necessarily. They are important because we are focusing on the patient when we measure outcomes, but that doesn't mean that whatever is measured and how the patient reports on that can actually or is appropriately communicated when research results are presented to consumers. So I think these are two different things. One is reporting an outcome and having a validated instrument to measure them. Another thing is to communicate them to the public. Therefore, for instance, that approach of these health outcome descriptors that go beyond patient-reported outcomes. Yeah. But obviously, I agree. You need to ask the patient. Sorry.
No, I mean, I totally agree. Those patient-reported outcomes should be built into the design of the trials using properly validated instruments. That's a big ask. But that's really important because ultimately that really matters to everyone. So, yeah.
So thank you very much. I would go for the second part.
Okay.
And please, Steve.
Sure.
The planned timing was artificially restricted. We usually have 90 minutes, so we are not late. We plan to finish at 35 minutes.
Well,
thank
I'll
you.
go hopefully fast. Just one quick thing, Holger. I just wanted to say that I love the summary findings table, and I love almost everything about it. One thing is the natural frequencies are probably not the ideal way to express this kind of information. And actually, the Santesso paper that you cited, which the great people did, actually agreed that the percentage format, based on a large trial that Lisa and I did comparing a bunch of different data presentation formats, actually probably works better. So that's something I saw in your the last thing you showed, the health outcome descriptors. You had some percentages, and you gave both frequency format, but the natural frequency format in and of itself, I don't think that that's necessarily the best way. And then the other thing is about the graph. I love the graphs, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done about validating those graphs and figuring out the best way to do it. But I think it's fabulous stuff. And the last thing, actually, in the end of this presentation, I talk a little bit about standardized language, and I'll hold off and tell you about that then. So the second bit is about helping people become wise consumers of information. So it's about teaching critical thinking skills, because no matter how good our materials are, we have the best summary of findings table, the best drug box. It doesn't matter if people can't use this information. And so when Lisa and I started doing the work about drug information, we thought, making the presentation formats good is really important, but you need much more to judge information. You need sort of conceptual framework and a way of thinking through things, and kind of like a healthy skepticism that teaches you to ask questions. So we created a curriculum which we actually use to teach journalists, but we also wrote a book for the public called Know Your Chances: How to See Through Hype in Medical News, Ads, and Public Service Announcements. And the idea is to provide people with tools to see through hype, to communicate transparently, and ideally make good medical decisions. And this book has a few features. It's example based. It's got quizzes so that people can assess their progress and develop some confidence that they're understanding the material. It has learn more bits where if you're interested in a concept, you can go deeper if you want. And it has a bunch of handy references to help people understand where to find good information. And the most fun thing is it was chosen by the US National Library of Medicine to be made available for free to people. So anywhere in the world, if you're interested in getting a free copy of it, you can go to this URL and get it. I mean, if you want to buy it, that's okay too. It's published by the University of California Press, but it's available for free. The curriculum has 4 parts. First is about risk. What is risk? How to think about risk. The second thing is about risk reduction, which is, Holger, you emphasized the point that I made earlier, that when we talk about benefit, you have to talk about harm. You can't decide if a benefit is worth it if you don't know what the cost in terms of risk or the harm is. Which is does the risk reduction have downsides? And then finally, this idea of healthy skepticism, how to push back again or look into claims, to think critically about claims to decide whether you can believe them or not. And as I mentioned, we use the same curriculum largely when we teach journalists. We run a 4-day workshop funded by the National Cancer Institute, and it teaches, research basics, the principles of research outcomes, research design, basic elements of risk communication. There's a bit on statistical uncertainty, observational studies and confounding, randomized trials, and screening and over diagnosis. But anyway, the book is meant to make all this stuff available to consumers. When we wrote the book, we thought, well, it's kind of ironic. Here we are creating these materials for the public about looking for evidence and wanting to know whether you can believe things rather than just accepting claims. So we thought we really ought to test the book to make sure it really works. So we actually did a randomized trial, 2 randomized trials of the book. One of them was done in a high socioeconomic status group. So these are people, these are alumni of Dartmouth, which is a fancy college back in the States. So this is kind of like the worried well. And we also did a trial in people who really need the information. This is people lower income, lower educational attainment people, and we wanted to make sure that the information was transparent for them as well. And the trials were identical. We randomized people to either the book, which we call the primer, or a control document, which I'll show you in a second. And then we assessed how well people understood the information. The control booklet was something produced by the US government, by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which was a general information booklet about risk and reducing risk with prevention and screening. The booklet I thought was not very good. It didn't have any training on how to interpret data, which is what our book was all about. And it was similar to the primer in length and reading level. So it seemed like a fair comparison. We got in trouble. The agency, the federal agency, was mad that we used them as the placebo group, but what are you going to do? The outcome measure, the question is how do you decide whether the book really worked? There was no good outcome measure, so we had to create our own, and we spent a long time developing and validating this questionnaire, this instrument called the Medical Data Interpretation Test. And it's an 18-item questionnaire, and it's scored on a scale from 0 to 100. It asks people to interpret real-world information. So in other words, we show them drug ads, news stories, press releases, and ask them questions to see whether they understood the information, whether they could see when information was missing, and whether they can pick up on hype and spin. And there are 4 basic domains. Now, so first is the knowledge basis for comparisons. So something like you need a denominator when people give you a numerator about risk. You can't, a numerator in and of itself is not enough. You need a denominator as well. Comparison tasks. We tried to see how well people could compare risk information. Calculations related to comparisons. So we wanted to see whether people could apply a relative risk. To see what their absolute risks were, and then context for comparison. With the information, background information that you need to make information meaningful, like are the people in the trial like me, in terms of age and gender and all that sort of stuff. So this is the results of the study. These are the two trials. In the high SES group, the primer group outperformed the control group. About 75% of people passed. That was a score of 75% or higher in the primer group versus about 55% in the control group. So an 18 percentage point absolute difference. And in the other group, in the low SES group, the baseline is down because remember, these are people with lower education and so on. But we see, again, a similar sort of effect that there was a 17 percentage point increase in the proportion of people who passed the test to show that they were able to understand this information. Basically, just to be clear for some context, the magnitude of the effect is in line with successful educational interventions like the use of practice exams prior to standardized testing. So we were satisfied that this was a meaningful effect. And as I said, the curriculum improved data interpretation skills in both the high and low socioeconomic status populations, which was very very good to know because we wanted to make sure that the information was accessible and useful to all sorts of people. And right now, this year, I'm planning on an updated edition, including an interactive version. I'm just starting to work on it, but hopefully that will be coming out one of these days soon. The only other thing I just wanted to say before I end, the drug box I mentioned, it presents information in this hierarchy of outcomes of the benefits and the harms of interventions. But we realized early on that sometimes people needed more context especially for outcome measures. So for example, surrogate outcomes. So again, these are like laboratory measurements, like your cholesterol level that you don't directly experience. But theoretically predict important patient outcomes. So we did a study to see whether adding a warning, a very simple warning to alert people to the fact that a surrogate outcome is not the same as a patient outcome, and to see whether it would make a difference in people's enthusiasm for information. So basically we tested these simple statements like this one, the drug has only been shown to affect the surrogate outcome. It's not known whether it'll help people feel better or live longer. Does a statement like that make a difference to consumers? And then we did a even more directive version of the statement by adding another sentence that telling them you should ask for a drug shown to reduce patient outcomes. And what we did was we did this randomized trial of a representative national sample of people, and we found that this simple statement made a difference. The percentage of people choosing, they were given two drugs that were the same, except one reduced the patient outcome and one only reduced the surrogate outcome. And we see that with the statement, more people chose the drug that reduced the patient outcome, which was good, 59% versus 71%, which is really good just for a few words to have an effect that big. The number of words to change, the NN word was very, very good. So, and we also asked people, imagine if your doctor recommended the drug that only had the patient, that only had the surrogate outcome, what would you do? More people said that they would ask the doctor for the drug that had the patient outcome, which again was very gratifying to see. The last thing I just want to say is, so we recently did, the most recent box I've done was for Aduhelm, which was until 2 weeks ago was the latest Alzheimer's drug. There were a lot of problems with this drug. It didn't work all that well. It has a lot of harms. And so the drug box really shows that. It shows, this is the data table. There were 2 trials, and in one, there was about a 0.03 point worsening compared to placebo on an 18-point scale, and the other one there was a 0.39 point improvement again versus this thing. And the point is that by presenting this information, you let people see the magnitude of the effect in these trials. But the thing that we added to this box that's new, and it's sort of like what we heard about with the summary findings tables, is we were trying to give some clue to people about the statistical significance. So we added these statements. This one was not statistically significant, so it may be a fluke. And also it was far smaller than the minimal clinically important difference that was established for this outcome measure. And so we say it's unlikely to be noticeable to people. So we're experimenting with some of these standardized language to see whether it will help people make better decisions. So we're trying to deal a little bit with statistical uncertainty. And then the other thing is the reliability of the data. So the summary of findings table uses those figures with the circles and the crosses, and then phrases like low certainty evidence. We just saw examples the Holger showed us, and what I want to do is add that sort of language here. But I find the grade language a little hard to understand, and so I'm actually doing a project with Andy Oxman, one of the founders of the grade approach, to develop more colloquial language. So for example, we're looking at a trial about wearing glasses and COVID. And this is an example, it's low certainty of evidence. And this is a colloquial way of saying low certainty evidence. It said, wearing glasses may reduce your chance of getting COVID a little, but we're not very confident about this. So we're just testing this sort of language to see whether it's possible to tinker with what's being used in summary of findings tables to see if it's a little more accessible to people. And then the last thing I just want to say is that the work that I've been talking about, I'm not the only one doing it. There's lots of people doing it, and there's the wonderful Testing Treatments International effort, which you can reach if you go to this website, and Informed Health Choices, which is another great effort to try to help people think critically about health choices, and I think they're really wonderful. And then all the materials that I've been talking about, and much more, it's all available for free on the Lisa Schwartz Foundation website at this website. And that is really all I have to say. So in conclusion, messaging matters. If the stakes are high, it's really important to develop and test messages before disseminating them. Bad messages harm, good messages help. The information sources, including the regulators, the media, and the public, all have work to do to make our messages more transparent and accessible. So there's reasons for pessimism because there's a lot of things that aren't really working all that well, but there's also reason for optimism. There's a lot of really good and important work being done, like we heard about today, and I think things are getting better. So anyway, that's it. If anyone has questions for me, of course, ask now, but you can always reach me on my email as well. So that's really all I have to say. So Holger, take it away.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks very much. So just a quick follow-up. Stephen, the work that Nancy has actually been doing is also focusing on these colloquial expressions, right? So a colloquial way of presenting certainty across the four grades, and it will be great to follow up on that. I do have a question, perhaps for you, Stephen, if that's okay. So all of that is great, right? We are trying to improve communication, etc. But what are we doing with education of people? Because there is some people like who are Garrett Giger and others who've always asked for better education. And when should this education start? And you mentioned Andy Oxman, and I'm wondering what you think about his work on the informed health choices that really addresses people who we typically don't have necessarily on our radar screen, which are children in relatively early childhood. So any thoughts on how we should be improving that part? Because it seems to be critical in the whole context of presenting information.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, the kind of education you're talking about, this ought to be routine education that children are getting as they grow up. And so, unfortunately, in most systems, apparently it's not being done. So I really applaud the work that Andy and Informed Health Choices are doing. I'm actually part of that organization, for full disclosure. Lisa and I tried to, we did some workshops with middle school children using our book. We just changed some of the examples to make them more relevant for kids. Like we used an example of an acne drug. We had another one about vaping, the kids really liked it. It was really fun. They liked the idea of being able to see through messages, that they have the skill to do it, and then also they like to challenge authority and to see that actually they can do it. So I'm very excited about that, and I know Andy's done wonderful work, and the testing treatment. The book was the Andy's book was tested in a randomized trial. I think it was inspired by our randomized trial, and so I really applaud that effort. And there are people here in Italy who are working on it as well. They were at this morning's a conference. So it's a very, very exciting thing, but it has to start early, and you have to keep coming back to it. So and this morning I did a little more in-depth talk about the way I teach journalists, but a lot of times what we're doing is we're drawing on skills that people have. They don't realize they know most of this stuff. So for example, when we teach journalists about like absolute risk and relative risk, they're like, oh, it's intimidating. I don't know what's going on. But I show them that if you go to a store and there's a sale and you're able to figure out what's going on, absolutely all of those things. So then all of a sudden they realize they've got these skills and they can draw on them. And so I think analogies like that are really, really helpful, and they're useful again in any age group. But anyway, I totally agree with you. We need to focus on educating children. We got to reach people early, but the people who aren't children anymore, we've got to reach them as well. And so,
okay,
yes.
Great. And I have no, that's wonderful. I have one other quick thing to show. That's how we discussed it with Nicola. That will take me about 3 minutes. Because again, it's follow up on what we were just talking about, and this relates to. Let me make sure that you can actually see my screen. I hope that is the case. About communicating public health messages.
Yes.
Okay, great. So it's following up on what we were just talking about. We, as you know, lots of our work is focusing on recommendations, health recommendations and guidelines. And we have noticed that in particular during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have actually been communicating public health messages, but did not have the public in mind. So here are a couple of examples of recommendations that are from original guidelines. This is an initiative that we did. It's called the COVID-19 Rec Map that compiles all recommendations on COVID-19 from any organization and provides an assessment of how well these recommendations are developed. But you see here, phrasing, the Canadian Rheumatology Association guideline panel suggests using COVID-19 vaccination in people with autoimmune disease. Here, another example for symptomatic patients with COVID-19 and risk factors for progression to severe disease who are not hospitalized, the WHO suggests the use, etc., etc. So what we've done is to create recommendations that we think are more focused on the public by using plain language, the term plain language recommendation, and it's based on a lot of work that was already cited today. And just very quickly, these are easy to read summaries of up-to-date published and quality checked recommendations from leading guideline organizations. They include a balanced statement, very much similar to what Stephen has presented and we talked about a bit earlier, explanations of the recommendations. So these are health recommendations, so that have gone beyond the just information step. It's actually people suggesting what to do, what it means for patients and the public, the actual source, and they are accessible for everyone, including patients, caregivers, and the public. And it's really about clearly informing patients or people about the benefits and harms of an intervention. And they're designed actually to promote self-care and prepares the public for a visit with their healthcare provider in many instances. This very similar to what we saw before, but focusing on health recommendations that are translated, the actual recommendation, who this is for, the strength of the recommendation, why a recommendation, for instance, is not strong, and any additional information you can do with this information and the intervention, and what you should do in terms of talking to your health professionals. And just very quickly, the big question is obviously if we're doing this right. This is based on a lot of background work, but like with everything else that we've talked about today, we are actually testing this in trials, and in actually 3 trials right now, in youth, in parents and caregivers, as well as general adults. And with going into much detail what we are seeing, these trials are just being submitted for publication, that we can actually improve through the use of plain language, the understanding of people of these recommendations. Because my line here is what public health recommendations are actually worth if the public does not understand them. And the COVID-19 pandemic has primarily focused on obviously public. If you think of vaccination, if you think of the use of masks and any other social barriers that people have used to reduce the impact of the pandemic.
Thank you, Olga, for this further work and further research into public understanding. Please, Steve.
Just, I think it's really wonderful to play. One of the problems that that I've noticed is that public health agencies, um, don't often test their messaging the way that you're doing, and it's a disaster. And in COVID, it was crazy. It's in the United States and elsewhere. And just very quickly, one of the things we did a trial. It sounds like we were doing like a lot of parallel play here. We did a trial looking at the FDA authorized instructions for how to interpret your home test kit, and they were terrible. And so we did a trial where we randomized people to either get those instructions properly designed using decision science or nothing, because some people don't read instructions. And then we showed scenarios like, you're sick and you've been exposed, but your test is negative. Are you going to go visit my mother? Or you're healthy, you haven't been exposed, and your test is negative, just to see whether people are dealing with the pretest probability. And we found a big effect. The good instructions were much better than the FDA instructions. And in fact, nothing was better than the FDA instructions. Bad instructions confuse people. So it really highlights the importance of what you're doing, of testing the messaging. And maybe we should be working together.
We absolutely should. That is a great outcome of this webinar. That so
sure. I'd like to add a few other things. I was happy you engaged in, Steve, in promoting your drug fact box for aducanumab. That's how I prefer to call Aduhelm, because we don't like proprietary names. And in my view, the best news for Europe is that European agency did not approve the drug. So one problem less in fighting for...
Yeah, but you got a new one coming. You got a new one.
Lecanemab. Let's see if it comes.
It's very similar profile.
Exactly. I agree. Then we will have another problematic moderate effect or modest effect and so forth. Two more things, as you mentioned this morning, informed health choices for the Italian translation. It has been translated, I would like to acknowledge, by Camilla Derighi and other colleagues. Is also for free, the Italian translation. They are providing tests in several or in a few schools, and we are trying to promote by Reggio Children in Reggio Emilia an initiative to educate teachers that could then promote in many classrooms. And as we are here exchanging information, I think, as I briefly discussed with Older recently, that this kind of information of medicines could probably be moved also to the food and how we eat, and who should fill the fridge and probably prepare. And the more we start early in childhood, the better for our health, I suppose. So there are a few technical questions coming on EU legislation, but I don't think you're probably the best guys to answer, because EU legislation, you're not working here, where they talk about summaries for lay people on the new drugs coming, which I think is great, but we should see on the complexity we have just discussed, who is going to prepare them, and the lots of work that is behind this. I think I also appreciated your being frank on some of the great language. Some expression for me are great. I truly love magnitude of benefit. I've been on quality of evidence, fine. On confidence in estimates, yes, I find it very technical, though rigorous. But I think the more we can see this as an integrated effort of all those involved in critical appraisal and bringing good information to the public and to the prescribers. One consideration that I would leave to you for a joint answer is, don't you think there is a convergence in comparison to 10 or 20 years ago, when we were thinking of clearly distinct information separate for the public and for the prescriber? Aren't this kind of though differently formatted, aren't we probably converging on one set only of information circulating? What's your view? Should we differentiate or should we converge?
I think we should converge. One of the principles that Lisa and I always had was that if we can show that patients, the consumers can understand stuff, then probably doctors can as well. And I think there's maybe some technical extra stuff that you might need to add, but by and large, the key message it's the same message, and it can be said clearly. If it can't be said clearly, there's something wrong either with the information or with the communicator.
You've been thought-provoking, then now I move to Holger, but I think as we usually tend to talk about medicines to prescribers, it's very convincing what you were provoking saying, that I think we should put an eye on being more friendly, more clear, and thinking that we're also talking to patients, to patient association, and probably to the lay public and citizens. Holger, what's your views on the Cochrane work on this?
I couldn't agree more. I think it's one version that we need that is understood by everyone. And the very quick anecdote is that I often sit in guideline panels where the patient or the people representatives, understand the information better than the clinicians, right? Mm-hmm. So what that means is that I don't think necessarily that a medical education or a health professional education makes you particularly smart about understanding information. So the point is that I think one version that really brings it down to the lowest common denominator, so that everybody understands is in my view the way to go. You can always use the onion analogy. You can always peel off layers. This was also brought up in our GIN conference by some journalists. You can always provide more information if people want to dig deeper, but the key messages should be understood by everyone, in my view.
I truly appreciate it. And I'm thinking and reflecting on this convergence that is more interesting than, thanks for the frankness and openness of the discussion. I'm really happy we engaged in this. I don't see other questions coming. I don't want to
Nicola, I just wanted to, please. Okay, there was one question that I wanted to answer because it's really important. The lay summaries are developed by lay people. Our plain language recommendations, I think there was a question about that a bit earlier, and I put it in the chat. Is a large team of lay people who actually do this development. So it's not the health professionals. And I think this goes back to the previous point that was made. It's really important that we work with the individuals who are the consumers.
No, sure, exactly. That's why I think I got that, but sure, it's important if you underscore that the essence of providing lay summaries from the research perspective is if it comes from the people. The EU clinical trial regulations puts forward that industry should provide summary of the results of the clinical trial in a format understandable to the lay person. Fine. And let's see when it comes and how it goes. I think it could be good to set common criteria that we were discussing also this morning. If you could have a set of principles that are somehow also ethical principles or the main rules we should follow that are pretty straightforward and seem to be convergent, I think it could be a good avenue to share for the near future. Yeah. So let me thank you a lot for this very nice 1 hour and a half. We have reached almost 950 participants, which I think is a good number given this technique. Thanks again, and hope we can meet all in person soon somewhere.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.